in this discussion. I first met Emily, I was a part of a group of volunteers that she was leading, teaching cooking classes to users of the food bank. And she was doing an AmeriCorps position here in Spokane, originally from the East Coast and moved over here. And so that's where I first met her. And then I found out later that she's a Learning Hour veteran, was one of the first people to ever join. And so it's been really cool to reconnect. And Emily's going to bring her grant writing experience and nonprofit experience and world to this conversation today. She recently switched from working in the nonprofit world full-time to going part-time and then going back to school for biomimicry. So ask her about that when you get the chance. And I'm really excited to have her on today to talk about where philanthropy can go wrong. And then I think, maybe we should have a second part to this series of where it's going right with you, Pam, and kind of explore beyond what we'll be able to talk about today in all the ways philanthropy is transforming. But as we learn from Emily today, I'd love to explore what the role of small businesses and individuals, what our role is, and what lessons we can learn from what she's going to share. So with that, I will stop talking and put up the PowerPoint.
Awesome.
Emily, take it away.
Well, thanks, Annie. Hi, everyone. I'm Emily. As Annie mentioned, I part-time student right now, like literally as of 2 weeks ago, and part-time at work. I work as a grant writer at Second Harvest in Spokane, and that's where I did my AmeriCorps year. And to answer the icebreaker question, I think probably aunties. I love just walking around and looking at books, and also the little the art co-op that's in the back of that. If you've never been there, once it reopens, like highly recommend just going in. It's all local artists and just browsing around. It's really cool. It's small, but I miss so much, but yeah, that's something that came to mind. Let's see. So yeah, a little bit more about my background in philanthropy and why I'm talking about this today, how I even got into this conversation. I have been at Second Harvest since 2017, first as an AmeriCorps position, AmeriCorps member for a year. And then when my term ended, I stayed on, joined the philanthropy team as a development writer. So I was basically writing our appeal letters, our newsletters, any kind of type of fundraising material, and supported our main grant writer there. And now I've since shifted last year to have more of a role and responsibility writing grants and grant reports and stuff like that. And then also in college, I did work for a foundation for a year in the Boston area. So a couple of disclaimers at the beginning. First one is that everything I share today is totally my perspective based on my own opinions and research. I'm not speaking for Second Harvest or any of my previous employers. So just want to make that clear at the beginning. And also, as Annie kind of touched on, and as Pam started to touch on as well, that, I think whether you technically worked in the philanthropy field or nonprofit world at officially, it's likely that we all have some sort of relationship with philanthropy, whether we've donated to a foundation or a nonprofit, or we volunteered our time, we've received services from a nonprofit that is funded through philanthropy. So I definitely welcome all perspectives in this conversation. I'm not the resident expert. I just happen to, be exposed to this conversation through my own research in philanthropy, and am committed to advancing it because I think it's an important conversation to have. But yeah, like I said, please, I welcome all perspectives and experience. So as Annie mentioned too, kind of how does this relate to small businesses and individuals? Well, I think a lot of businesses, especially B corporations, they like to be involved in the community, and a way that they do that is sometimes they could donate to organizations. So I think it's important for them to know how kind of some of the pitfalls of the philanthropy world, so that way they know where their money is going. And likewise, individuals who are supporting socially responsible businesses like B corporations, often they do that because they care about where their money is going and how it's being used. And just an assumption that I think is safe to make is that if they're donating, they care about where their money is going when they're donating as well, not just in a for-profit setting. So and we can kind of circle back to this, how it relates at the end, but just wanted to lay that out at the beginning. So why don't we move to the next slide, Annie? I was inspired this week I came across an article that had a couple Dr. King quotes that I felt really contextualized this conversation for the time that we're in right now. I won't read the whole thing because it's a little bit long, but feel free to read on your own. The one line that really does stand out to me here, though, he's basically saying that it's, the white moderate more so than any other obstacle, outright white supremacist, is his concern and going to be an obstacle to justice and to racial equality. The line that stands out here regarding this conversation is, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom. So I just wanted to set up the conversation with that quote, just inspired by the week that we're in with MLK Day on Monday and the inauguration as well. This is another quote that I love from Courage of Care, which is an organization that I follow, but caring is a systems project. Yeah, you can move on. I thought that's just wanted to give you some insight into how I'm thinking about this, I guess, but. Okay, before we dive into, I'll just give you a little bit of an overview of where we're gonna go with this today. We're gonna talk about how do we get here, a brief history of philanthropy. I promise I'll keep it short. It's not gonna be a big history lecture. And then kind of talk about where are we now in philanthropy. I'll go through just a few key policies and norms and practices in the philanthropy world. And then we can kind of have a conversation and do some visioning of where might we want to go with philanthropy. And that can be a great segue into part 2, as Annie was talking about. Before we dive into the brief history lesson, I wanted to just open it up a little bit and ask why, if you have donated to an organization before or volunteered, or if you haven't, but if you could or wanted to, why would you donate? What would some of your intentions be? And feel free to just come off mute and say something.
I haven't donated because I don't make much money, but I would like to donate to an organization called Ashoka. And they basically run on the idea that there needs to be systems change, and then running with that, there's ways to promote when someone finds a good solution to a problem, finding ways to create localized solutions to that one project solution in different countries around the world. So for example, there's a project in India that helps called Childline, that helps bring solutions to any sort of child abuse in homes. And then they have worked through organizations in other countries to make that work in all other Southern Asian countries in the area.
So Henry, why Ashoka for you in particular?
They really run on the idea of efficiency and effectiveness. I feel like my money would actually go really well spent if I were there.
Great. Thanks.
For a while, I was like giving $5 a month to this organization called Repurpose Global. And it was it was started by college students in Southeast Asia. And the idea was that you were offsetting your plastic footprint by they were like collecting and paying and creating more formalized jobs in the waste sector, I think specifically in India. So it was just like interesting multi-level, like it's interesting to see like maybe how it will grow, but it's just one way to think about like how can giving be on a really micro scale. And I think like much in the same boat as Henry of like not feeling like I have a lot to give, but then how do I still implement giving in some way? Like I budget for other things, and I'm trying to think about how to budget for that even in a very small way, just to start.
Giving as a practice. I love that.
Yeah.
I think for me, I donate mostly hours, a lot of hours to master gardeners, a lot of hours to master composters, founding board member, and a lot of hours to Inland Northwest Community Gardens. I think I generally choose, if I'm working with a nonprofit or a government agency, generally choose something that has a mission that reflects my values. So.
Great. Thanks. Pam, did you want to chime in?
I think one of the things we've tried to do is to basically think of programming. I think, Emily, you may have phrased it this way, of programming the donations that we do. Now that we are empty nesters, so we're in a very different stage of life than a lot of you all. And our children, yay, finally finished college, yay. But we basically have tried to make a commitment to at least 10% of whatever income we have going towards various charitable organizations. And just like programming for retirement savings, we've tried to automate it as much as possible so that we, as we're setting up our family budget, don't even think about having that money available. Mm-hmm. It's just, it's set aside, and we may not know exactly where it's going to go. We try and do things through the year as opportunities come up or as we learn about different charitable organizations. But a lot of ours, certainly this last year, has been trying to address some of the racial and social injustices that we've been exposed to and where we find intersectionality. So one of our kids loves to rock climb, and we found an organization that works with Black kids to get them out rock climbing. And it's like, oh, that's a great organization to put money towards. As much to let them know that there were other people out there who were aware of their mission and aware of what they're doing and supporting them in that mission. As you know, the $100 might or might not have made a big difference to them, but it was as much acknowledging the work that they were doing.
I love that.
That's a really cool way to think about it. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you all for sharing those. I just wanted to kind of put those out there. And as you're able to kind of keep those in the back of your mind as we're talking about these things, as those intentions for giving, and maybe try and, we can circle back to them at the end if there's time, but kind of track them through as a thread throughout this conversation. Okay, so a brief history of philanthropy. I promise I don't have like a bunch of slides with like a bunch of data points and stuff. It's just kind of to track where we are in the conversation. So, and full disclosure, I do have notes in front of me. So if I'm looking down, that's what I'm looking at. But a brief history of philanthropy as told by Christina Shimizu. I wanted to give credit because I have not done a totally deep dive into the history of philanthropy for myself. This is actually, a version of history of philanthropy that I heard on a podcast called The Ethical Rainmaker. And Christina Shimizu, who was actually a Seattle-based political activist and one of the founders of community-centric fundraising, which is a great resource for if you want to dive deeper into this conversation. She explained this history on the podcast, so I'm going to kind of summarize it. And I also want to make clear from the beginning, when I'm talking about philanthropy here, I'm talking about what I call mainstream philanthropy. There are a lot of really, really cool, really innovative things happening in the philanthropy world that's kind of pushing back against the norms that we're going to talk about today. But what I'm talking about is kind of formalized philanthropy, mainstream philanthropy, what kind of the policies around philanthropy dictate. So kind of before philanthropy was formalized, what in the US, what did it look like? In white culture, which again is largely what I'm talking about here, because that's kind of what's legislated around. In white culture in the US, it looked like mutual aid that focused on women and children because those were the people that were deemed deserving of care. So already we're seeing these roots of kind of saviorism and paternalism in the way that we create support systems in our culture. And then when philanthropy was actually formalized, so to speak, in 1907, when Margaret Olivia Slocum Sage, the second wife of a railroad baron, Russell Sage, founded a foundation, the first foundation in the US, because she inherited $70 million with his death. Keep in mind that's $70 million in 1907, and formed that foundation. And this was also at the time of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which prevented Chinese American laborers who had essentially built and worked on the railroad from acquiring any wealth through, they couldn't own property, so they really couldn't acquire any wealth. So kind of the main point I want to make with this is that the first foundation was created with wealth that was created from the exploitation of labor, specifically the exploitation of labor of people of color that didn't have access to any of that wealth because of a policy that excluded them, even though they were the ones helping to build it. So then that was, again, the first foundation, 1907. Then there's been several policies that have kind of helped formalize our philanthropic system since then. I won't go through them all. I'll just mention there's one in the Revenue Act of 1913. It created the 501c3 tax exempt status for nonprofits, which basically means, if a nonprofit, when you hear the word nonprofit, they very, very likely have a 501c3 status, meaning that they're tax exempt. It also created an income tax mandate on high incomes. So with that policy, and then several policies that came after that, basically wealthy people could use 501c3 organizations, which includes foundations in this case, as a tax loophole. And an avenue to decide where their money would go or wouldn't go, rather than it be distributed publicly through the tax system. Because remember, that money is not taxed. And when I say to use it as a tax loophole, that's not to say that, they were doing it only to avoid paying taxes. Many of them, I'm sure, as we all just talked about, really aligned with the mission and values of the places that they were giving money to. But still, I think it's really important to note that that money is therefore not being redistributed publicly through the tax system. So to kind of conclude the brief history of philanthropy, kind of, again, the main point I want to make here is that people with wealth essentially created the conditions of poverty by exploiting labor, and then use their wealth gained through that exploitation to set up the systems to determine how to address that poverty and how people in poverty should be cared for. So again, we're seeing the same paternalism and saviorism that we saw in kind of pre-formalized philanthropy, very much reified in our formal philanthropic system today. Now, I know that was a lot of information, and there, possibly a lot of new information. Does anyone have any questions about that before I move forward? Pam?
So one thing I was wondering about is I know sometimes those foundations have mandates of like how much money they have to distribute.
We're gonna get to that.
Okay.
Yeah.
But that's not a legal thing, right? Or anyway, I'll let you get to it. Okay.
Okay,
Never
yeah.
mind.
Yeah, we're gonna talk about the next actually, but anything else? Any other questions? Okay, great. Again, I know it's a lot to digest, so okay, great. So where are we now? Philanthropy as a means to warehouse wealth. This term this phrase warehousing wealth, I think, I don't know, maybe it's really poignant for me because, you know, at Second Harvest, when I was going into work, I'm now remote, but, you know, I'd walk into a warehouse every day and see it full of food, and just to picture so much money just sitting there, not that food's just sitting there at Second Harvest, we're obviously moving it, but just the visual of a warehouse full of money that is not being used to help solve social problems is just a really poignant image to me. Pam, you mentioned the payout rate. So that's kind of the first thing I'm going to talk about here. In general, I'm going to talk about a few kind of norms and mandates in the philanthropy world that kind of lead to philanthropy being this, rather than like an avenue for money to flow through, it's kind of like a dam where money is stopping and not flowing through to their communities in a lot of cases. So the first way that happens is through the 5% payout rate. Does anyone know what that is? Do you know what that is, Pam?
No, not exactly.
Okay.
And a little knowledge is a dangerous thing for me.
Give someone else the opportunity to.
Is that where they can say that they are a charitable organization or have a philanthropic, I can't say that word, basis, is if they pay at least 5% out?
Yeah, basically. So private foundations, and so without getting too technical, there's private foundations and there's public foundations. When I say private foundation, think of a family foundation. That would be a great example of a private foundation. So they are mandated to give out 5% of their endowment annually to qualified charities, or in other words, a 501c3 organization. Think, when I say qualified charity, basically a nonprofit. So they have to give out 5% every year. It used to be 6%. And then in 1981, people fought to lower it to 5%. And that 5% includes their overhead. So that includes keeping the lights on, it includes staff salaries. So 5%. Now we're gonna play a little Price is Right. Does anyone want to guess how much money private foundations have sitting in their endowments right now? Any number.
15 trillion.
15 trillion.
I'll take the over.
Over.
100 trillion, yeah.
Okay, it's not that much, but it's still a lot. It's $1.2 trillion.
Okay.
Oh, I should have thrown out my number.
And keep in mind that's just private foundations. That's not public foundations, which are like community foundations.
Say that number again, Emily.
$1.2 trillion. Sitting in endowments right now. They have to get. Go ahead,
Michelle or Emily. Well, just is that excluding universities as well? Private universities.
That's a good question. I don't know. I'd have to look up to see if they're considered private or public. I'm guessing they're considered public, but I don't know for sure.
Okay.
So Emily, I know this is not, I just want to say this. Edward Jones, this is a public information. Edward Jones, if we take all of our clients, we have offices in every single state in the United States plus Canada. We have 1.5 trillion under care, and that's all of our clients' wealth. So, I mean, just to me, that's how I can see, oh my gosh, it's like every client we have, that is equivalent to that. That is mind blowing to me. So
pretty crazy.
And so these are the foundations, like if you watch PBS and they scroll through at the end, you know, it's the Robert Johnson Foundation or something like that, right? That's who we're talking about.
Yeah, I am not super familiar with, you know, with PBS, but likely yes. Yeah, I think if they're family foundations, then yes, they're a private foundation. And so only one more number I want to throw out is that only 8 to 8.5% of the 5% that's being distributed to the community each year goes to communities of color, or organizations led by or serving communities of color. So that's a very, very, very small, you know, piece of the pie, as it were. And so why might, if you were, you know, leading a foundation, why might you only want to give out 5% every year?
I guess just like the idea that, oh, we have to keep it for the future, right? And so that we can keep growing and continue to be a foundation.
Exactly. Yeah, that's people. Yeah, they say they want to exist for perpetuity. They want to be around to solve future problems, which there's something to be said for that. But I like to quote Vu Lee, who's another leader in this conversation. He has a great blog called Nonprofit AF that I highly recommend. He's very funny, but also very informative. But I heard him use the analogy somewhat recently that you know, these foundations are saving for a rainy day when there's a monsoon outside, like especially with COVID going on. Like we are in the deepest financial crisis since the Great Depression, and there has been more of a call on foundations to increase their payout rate. But that payout rate of 5% was intended to be the minimum. And it's kind of become the ceiling now, again, in mainstream philanthropy. There are not many foundations that are giving out a lot more than that regularly. Any questions about that?
Well, I know for university endowments that often it's, they sort of look at it that we're only going to pay out in scholarships or whatever the earnings on the principal, that we don't touch the nest egg that we've got.
And I would say, I think universities are in a bit of a different category as well, because it makes sense for them to continue to be around. Whereas a foundation that, you know, claims to want to help end hunger or help, you know, end homelessness or houselessness, that's a problem that if they solve it now, hopefully it won't be around later. Whereas
I can add something there. Sorry
Sure.
to cut you off. My dad used to work for the Stanford Foundation. And he worked fairly high up and wanted to incorporate impact investing into their portfolio. And when he brought it up, their basic response was laughing him out of the room and telling him that the entire idea of what they're doing there is simply to raise money for the school. Where impact investing can be profitable, they just ignored him. And so it's just, there's an ignorance to investing in something beyond just profit with the industry.
Definitely. Thanks for that.
That's part of my interest in hearing this, because trying to guide my clients in a better way. And, you know, just like you said, just wanted to chime in.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. Okay, so that's the 5% payout rate. The second kind of norm that I wanted to go over quickly are donor advised funds. Does anyone here know what a donor advised fund is?
Sounds like the donor is real hands-on to me. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
I was going to say, again, a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. My impression is that you can basically set up your own charity or your own giving vehicle. So let's say I made $100,000 this year. I could put $10,000 into a donor advised fund, but I don't have to give out that money during this current year. So that I can take the tax write-off this current year. I can give $2,000 for each of the next 5 years. And I can pretty much control where and how the money gets spent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you have more than a little bit of knowledge. Don't sell yourself short, Pam. So donor advised funds are pretty much exactly what Pam just said. They are housed under public foundations, so community foundations. Our community foundation in Spokane, if that's where everyone is Inovia Foundation. So they have a service footprint that includes Spokane as well as some Eastern Washington counties, and they go into Idaho as well. Yeah, when you think of public foundations, think of community foundations. And yeah, it's exactly what Pam said. They're giving vehicles for people who maybe they don't want to set up their own foundation, or they don't have enough wealth to set up their own foundation, but they like the foundation model and being able to put their money somewhere, let it be invested and grow, and then they can advise, just like the name says, where the money goes. But Pam kind of also pointed out the pitfall that, you know, when I give to a donor advised fund, I can get a tax exemption right away. But unlike private foundations that have to give out 5% every year, there's absolutely no mandate that money in a donor advised fund ever has to go to the community or to a qualified charity. So it could sit there forever. And now actually we're seeing that some private foundations are giving to donor advised funds as part of their 5% payout. So it's kind of like this dam after a dam kind of thing happening here. So again, it can just sit there and grow.
Hey, Emily.
Yep.
Just what's the benefit to the donor to letting it sit there?
That's a great question. I mean, it's not like as far as I know, they can't get that money back.
Mm-hmm. And they're not benefiting from any interest income or anything like that, correct?
Any what?
Interest income? Yeah.
Not that I know of, but I would have to do a little bit more research on that just to see. But again, the benefit, this is not to letting it sit there. This will happen either way, but they'll get a tax exemption right away. So speaking of money sitting in donor advised funds, another Price is Right. Does anyone want to guess how much money is sitting in donor advised funds right now? I'll give you a hint. It's lower than private funds.
$500 million.
$500 million.
I was gonna say 5 billion.
5 billion.
Say $500 billion.
What was it? $500 billion? Okay, so it's somewhere in between. It's $120 billion sitting in donor advised funds right now. Yeah, so again, it's back to the warehouse image, just kind of sitting there right now, and there's so many problems that could be improved, if not solved, with more funding. So let me just check the time. Okay, I'll go over just one more. It's more about how foundations give out their money in terms of grant making. So this is something I'm more familiar with, obviously in my job. So I just wanted to talk about a couple ways that grant makers often, grant makers meaning foundations, often give grants. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, basically how a grant typically works is a foundation says, we want to help solve this problem in the community. We're taking applications, if they accept applications. Some are invitation only, which is a whole other conversation, but we're accepting applications for, if you're working on this issue, give us this proposal. There's these expectations and limitations. We will review the proposals and get back to you. And then decide who gets what amount, if any at all. So many foundations will only fund innovative programs, and they won't fund general operations, capital projects, meaning like equipment, or if they needed to build or buy a new building, staff salaries, things like that. They want their money to go directly to the program itself, and the program needs to be innovative. They won't fund general operations. Now, this is not all foundations. This is just some. So, general operations is, well, I'll just say this. When money is restricted like that to a program, it really kind of, it obviously restricts what the money can be used for, and it's not giving the nonprofit their own sovereignty to decide, this is what the needs are in our community right now, and this is how we can best do the work that we're doing. Most foundations only fund for 1 year at a time. And then they also say, we don't want to be a sustaining funder. There's this like dreaded sustainability question on grants, like, how will you sustain this project after, you don't have funding from us anymore? And it's kind of like, well, if we had our own money, we wouldn't be asking for money from you. And it's hard to, the work that needs to be done it's going to take time, and 1 year grants really it's hard to commit to the work when for an organization, if they don't know if they are going to be able to keep doing it. And with that, a lot of foundations only fund projects if they already have other support. They don't want to be the first one to go out on a limb and say, we will fund you, which there's definitely some legitimacy to that, to wanting to be fiscally responsible. But it really restricts, it keeps kind of mainstream philanthropy as funding mainstream solutions, when there are a lot of other innovative solutions out there that they're not getting funding because they're new. So Vu, who I mentioned earlier, often says that he wants more. He calls it, my God, multi-year general operating dollars. My God, he said that's what foundations need to be giving, which I just find that kind of funny. So there's only about 10 minutes left. I want to be respectful of time. So I wanted to kind of move on now to, where do we want to go in philanthropy? What could it look like? And now I kind of want to open it up to more of a conversation. And I know that, again, that was a lot to digest, might be new, there might be some cognitive dissonance happening. But based on what you just heard, what would you want to see different? And again, this is assuming that you want to see differently. Maybe you're totally okay with the system. By now, it's very evident that I have a very clear opinion on this. But yeah, so just kind of want to open it up to the floor. What would you want to see done differently, if anything?
Would you repeat the my God again?
Yeah, my God stands for multi-year general operating dollars.
Mm.
And when he's saying multi-year, he wants 5, 10, 20, year funding. I have the most I've ever seen a foundation give in my personal experience working is 2. And that was 1 or 2 foundations that I can think of.
Which is hard for somebody like Second Harvest, who their primary function is getting food in and getting food out,
Mhm.
you know, like how do you innovate around that to be doing stuff that would, which I understand they did a lot this year with like the programs from the federal government that linked farmers to the food banks, to the communities and stuff, but
Right.
yeah. Well, I want to say one of the things that I really liked was, and I apologize that I don't know her name because I'm really bad with names, Jeff Bezos's ex-wife, who committed billions of dollars to charities. And when she realized that this year, in 2020 in particular, that her foundation was just dribbling out money, she's like, no, let's get more money out. Let's do it now. Let's find the people who are being good at using that money to relieve some of the suffering that's happening now, and sort of showed other people up as to, oh, I can do this and still have lots of money left over.
And she's doing it with only a small team of like 4 or 5 people. So instead of creating a giant like Gates Foundation, it's just this small group advising her, and then she's intending to get rid of it in like 10 years or, you know, a really short period of time.
That's awesome. That reminds me of something that Edgar Villanueva, who's again another leader in this conversation, he talks about, he's like, I don't want your payout, like I want your endowment. Like, what would it look like to say, rather than giving us a grant, like commit to over time giving us your endowment or a portion of your endowment. That would be really, really transformative. And it's cool to hear that she's happening, and someone with so much influence. I hope that really kind of pushes others to do the same.
Is it possible, Emily, that the system has just been reused and reused and reused, and instead of grants, it should be sponsorships that we put ourselves out of a job, and that's our goal, where we sponsor a belief and a cause versus just granting. Because I remember when I was on the United Way, we did subcommittees and we were fielding applications. It was my first time, and everything you said was on the application. Are they sustainable? Is this the first application of money that they are? Do they have other people supporting them? And so my thought was, oh, we're being good stewards, but it's the system has been set up and it's established. And so I thought that's the way things are. But I think they need to be educated in what your missions are trying to accomplish long term, instead of just, you kind of understand what I'm trying to articulate very bad.
I think I do. And let me know if this is not what you're trying to say, is that foundations can have more of a partnership relationship, rather than saying, here's this money, we're going to throw this at you and report back on it in 6 months. Say, okay, what do you really need, and how can we support you, and let's work with you. No, that's awesome. I love the idea of sponsorship, or like gonna really take on this cause with you.
And put ourselves out of a job. I mean, the goal is, why do we want it into perpetuity? Why? You know, ideally we want to solve the problem, not continue the problem.
Yeah, that's awesome.
One thing that I think could be beneficial is perhaps instead of giving money, is for businesses in particular to do something. So I think this is something you and I talked about a few months ago, Emily, is, you know, there's a lot of talk about food deserts and people not having access to healthy food. And as a grocery store chain, you know, instead of giving money to help address that problem, they could just put grocery stores in those areas, which they're reluctant to do because there's not as much profit to be made. But if they would just locate their stores in those areas, potentially take a loss on operating them there, that would be more meaningful than them distributing money, say, to Second Harvest, to then distribute the food to other people. So I think that could be really beneficial, and help maybe better address the problem. Absolutely.
Thanks, Mark.
I can sort of talk about my experience with Ohana, and before I say anything, I want to also say that these are my thoughts and not representative of Ohana necessarily, but We run into a problem at Ohana where a lot of our grants that we're given are specifically for certain areas, and the ideas that Ohana runs on are ones that the leaders of Ohana know are important to the community, but the grants that are given aren't necessarily given to grow those programs. So there's that issue that we don't have the funding to start those programs. And there's multiple issues within the area, but over time they'll flatten out, and Ohana won't have those issues. But it makes it difficult for a nonprofit like Ohana to start up because of these restricted grants that only allow you to do certain things with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that speaks really beautifully to one thing that I've heard, kind of a call I've heard made to foundations in this conversation, is to make sure you have people with lived experience of these issues on your board, helping decide where this money goes. Edgar Villanueva, who I mentioned before, he helps run a fund called Liberated Capital, and basically, people donate to the fund, and then there's a board of indigenous people who help decide where the money goes, and it goes to other indigenous-led and other BIPOC-led, essentially, organizations. And I just think that's a really, really cool model. And just thinking, Henry, if people on foundations had the same understanding of what the needs are in the community that the nonprofits actually doing the work do, there wouldn't be that mismatch as much, potentially.
Yeah, I agree. And I hate to bring up my dad, but he really inspires me. But he listens to me a lot because he didn't necessarily have the experience in any sort of nonprofit work. He's always worked in investing. So I really just am inspired by how much he listens to my opinions on philanthropy and the changing world that we live in.
That's awesome. No, bring up your dad. Love it. Let's do it.
Yeah, that listening piece is just what I was going to say. I just feel like there's like a lack of trust, and there really should just be more trust and less like even babysitting of money a lot of the time. And that's where I think just small businesses have so much power in their local communities, just because they can give with trust and form those relationships and direct that money to communities of color and the point of listening really strikes a chord. And I just think about us as a small business, and as we guide other businesses in their giving journeys, it's really interesting to think about how we share what should be valued, or how we guide them in their journey of where they give.
I want to. Sorry, Annie, go ahead.
No, go.
I kind of along these lines, I want to give a quick example. I know we're kind of almost at time, but of something that Second Harvest actually does that I think really illustrates the power of kind of this vision that we're talking about. We have a program called Bite to Go. Some of you might be familiar with it, but basically it's a weekend backpack program for students in food insecure homes. So a lot of them are relying on free and reduced school meals during the week. This is obviously pre-COVID, and weren't having a lot of access to food on the weekends. So they basically at school, they get a kit of meals and snacks to go home over the weekend. And the way that this is set up is actually local businesses and some churches as well, but I think primarily businesses sponsor a school. And they commit to covering the funds, or covering the price of food for that school. And they're asked to commit for a minimum of 3 years, which I think is amazing because there's some security there for the school and the students. And also what I think is the most beautiful part of this program too is Second Harvest came up with something called a more menu, where the school can kind of get the conversation started with the business that's sponsoring the school, saying, okay, it has a list of like, what else might we need? What else might we need? Do we need a coat drive in the winter for students? Do we need a backpack and school supply drive at the beginning of the year? And it gets a conversation started with the business saying, these are some other needs that we have. Do you think you can help meet them? And most of the time the business is like, yes, let's do it. And I neglected to mention that the business also provides the volunteers, and a lot of them during COVID have actually, during remote learning, have volunteered to go to the student's house to drop off the Bite to Go kit because they're not in school. And in addition to providing the food, providing these other needs. And so I just think that's a great example of a small business relationship with a nonprofit it's really centering the needs of the vulnerable group and really working in partnership with them rather than saying, this is what we're funding, you have to meet these criteria. It's very different when giving is in the context of a relationship. There's so much more flexibility and it can be so much more transformative. It might not be as big, but it's a lot deeper, and I think there's a lot of power there.
Yeah.
I wish we could go on forever. But
yeah, I was gonna say, I would love to do a part 2 at some point about just really looking at what smart giving is and what beneficial giving can look like, and dive more into where we can go. Thank you, Emily, for guiding us through this, and thank you everyone for being here.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for participating. Yeah, I just wanted to end with this quote. Again, you can read it on your own, but I came across this quote this week too, so it just felt fitting for the conversation we were having.
Bookend, an MLK bookend.
Yeah, exactly. If anyone wants to continue this conversation, Annie has my contact info. I'm happy to chat more.
And
yeah.
Emily has a lot of amazing resources, like just blogs and podcasts that are really fun to listen to. And I'll put them all on the Facebook page of this event if you're interested.
Cool. Thanks, Emily.
Great. Thank you all.
Yeah. And thanks everyone for attending too. Appreciate your support.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Annie. Thank you. Nice seeing you all.
Bye, Kathy.
Good to see you all.
Bye.
Bye.
Everyone.